We get a lot of wood lice in our house. In the house where I grew up as a child, we used to get earwigs. And my mother used to dispatch them with the words, "They're good mothers." Now, I don't know where my mother got that from, or in what way an earwig could be said to be a good mother, but my mum was always right, so I guess it's true. And on Mothering Sunday, it's appropriate to ask the question, what makes a good mother? Now, I know if I asked you all that question, we would probably come up corporately with quite a long list, quite a daunting list for those of us who are mothers. But I think there are two things that would probably feature very strongly on all of our lists. And one of them would be, a good mother loves all her children unconditionally, equally. She doesn't have favourites. And secondly, I think we would all agree that a good mother corrects unacceptable behaviour. Now, interestingly, these are two qualities that are mentioned by James in his letter to the churches that were read today. So did James have a good mother? Well, you might be thinking, how do we know? Well, we do know that James's mother was Mary, the mother of Jesus, because James and Jesus were half-brothers. And I think we can assume that God would choose someone who would be a good mother to be the mother of his beloved son. So yes, we can probably say that James had a good mother. And he grew up to become the leader of the church in Jerusalem, which was the first Christian church, and so would probably be regarded by the other churches as being the mother church. In the same way as St Mary's could be regarded as the mother church of Whitefriars, for those of you who know the origins of Whitefriars Church. And Whitefriars could be regarded as being the mother of the well. So, did James draw on his experience of being mothered in this letter? He was probably getting on a bit when he wrote this letter to the churches, and they probably looked up to him and respected him and listened and took on board what he had to say. So what's he saying then? So he's saying, first of all, don't show favouritism in church life. When we read this passage, I mean, my mind boggles. Well, other churches have actually said to people, oh, you're a bit shabbily dressed this morning, maybe a bit pongy, you sit on the floor or stand at the back. Oh, you can have the best seat, looking at the wealthy people who were finely dressed. So maybe there weren't enough seats to go round, and that's how they decided who got to sit down and who got to sit on the floor or stand at the back. Now, I've been to many, many churches in my life. I wouldn't like to think how many, and I am yet to come across a church that means tests people as they walk in through the door and gives the best seats to the people who are dressed in the finest clothes. And I hope I never come across a church like that. Maybe we've just all taken on board this section of James's letter and we're all fine with it. But actually, I think James is just using that as an example. It's very easy for us to gloss over that and say, oh, we don't have that problem, we're fine on that, tick, move on. But actually, if you look at chapter 2, verse 1, James says, don't show favouritism. And then further down the page, on verse 9, he says, if you show favouritism, you sin. This is in a church context. Okay, I'll say that again because it's actually quite shocking. If you show favouritism, you sin. So, okay, so most churches don't show favouritism according to wealth. I hope not anyway. But how else might a church show favouritism? The church could favour those who are white as opposed to people of colour. A church could favour those who are middle class as opposed to working class. A church could favour those who are well educated as opposed to people who don't have GCSEs, who maybe went to a special school, who had learning difficulties. Our church could favour those who know their Bibles very well, who are very up on church doctrine and Christian doctrine. The church could favour people of a certain age, maybe writing off people once they get beyond a certain age, or they're old, they're people to look after, they've got nothing to offer. Or maybe regarding people who are below a certain age, or they're too young to be a proper church member or even a proper Christian. They'll have to grow up a bit before we can actually use them and accept them as a full member of the church. Maybe a church that's very keen on music could favour people who are musical as opposed to people who are tone deaf. And maybe a church could favour extroverts. I was in a church like that, where if you didn't have an extrovert personality, you felt somehow that your face didn't fit, that you weren't quite right. Or a church could maybe favour males as opposed to females. I've seen adverts of church events where the lineup of speakers and worship leaders are all men. What's going on there then? Let's not forget that the church isn't just a body out there. The church is me, and the church is you, and the church is all of us. And how easy is it for me to favour people who are like me? I've been thinking a lot about this whole thing about favouritism recently, and the more I unpack it, the more convicted I feel of my own attitudes. Because if we have this group of people who are our favourites because of whatever reason, because of their gender, because of their education, because of their background, because of their social standing, whatever reason they're the favourites, anybody outside of that group are being discriminated against, aren't they? It's a form of prejudice. And it comes without saying that a church should not be cliquey. I'd like to anchor this, just to give a concrete example. I'd like to anchor it in refreshments after the service. Now, some people find that very difficult. Typically, people on the autistic spectrum find this whole milling about, mingling, all these social occasions very difficult, partly because they don't know who to talk to and what to say, and partly because of the general kerfuffle and the sensory overload of the echoey noise and the bright lights. And so some people wear headphones and maybe dark glasses to help to cut out some of that sensory overload. And then immediately everybody else thinks they don't want a conversation, when probably they would love a conversation with someone. How can we help those people? I know for me, it's very easy for me in the refreshments after the service to talk to people who I know very well, people I get on with very well, people I see eye to eye with on all sorts of issues. And it is more difficult and more of an effort for me to talk to people who are different from me, maybe a different age, people I don't know very well. I think it is so important that we, all of us, make that effort, particularly reaching out to people who maybe are social misfits or have additional needs. How accessible are we as a church to people who've got learning disabilities, for example? How dementia friendly are we as a church? Now, I'm talking about coffee time after the service. That's just one example. And I know at the moment you're probably thinking, well, we don't have coffee time after the service. We have Zoom refreshments. And I know a number of people have said they really value Zoom refreshments because they are forced into a group. They don't get to choose their breakout rooms. And they are put with people they maybe don't know. And they're actually getting to know those people, and that is a really good thing. I love Zoom refreshments. It's a bit like a party game. I'm thinking, I wonder who I'll be with today. But even in Zoom refreshments, there can be a situation, and I've been part of the cause of this, I know, where some people are left out of the conversation. So there are lots of things we can do. We just think. Those people who are on the fringe, those people who aren't included, how can we draw them in? What about those people who are members of Whitefriars Church and haven't been to church for, it will be well over a year before we start meeting again. They maybe didn't come when it was sitting in the squares in the hall because maybe they were afraid of catching COVID. They didn't go when it was in the field. It's been over a year since they've been to church. Maybe their only experience of church is songs of praise on a Sunday on the television. How can we help them? Those who don't have Wi-Fi, those who have not been in regular contact. I know that people have reached out and a number of ways have been used to try to help them to see that we haven't forgotten them and they are still part of us, and that is really good. How can we help to draw them back in when we start to meet again? I want to tell you two true stories. One is a lady I used to support. She's not a member of Whitefriars Church. She has serious mental health issues and she also has learning difficulties. She's a person you'd think of as a social misfit. And I took her to Stanwick Lakes one morning to a craft morning. And the tutor let on that she had a physical health problem that was making it difficult for her to do her crafting. So after the crafting was over and we sat with this lady having lunch. She's a Christian. I said to her, should we offer to pray for the tutor for healing for her physical health problems, because it's stopping her doing her crafts that she loves? And this lady with severe mental health problems and learning disabilities, said to me, yes, without hesitation. So I said, come on then. So we approached the tutor and we said, we're Christians and we believe that God answers prayer. And we'd love to pray for you right now. And the tutor was up for it. She said, oh yes, that would be really nice. So I said to this lady, you pray. And I stood and watched while this lady took the tutor's hands in hers gently and prayed a very simple prayer for healing. I was really touched by that, and I'm sure the tutor was really touched by that. I don't know what the outcome was in terms of healing, but it taught me a lesson. It taught me that people who are needy are not just people for me to look after and serve and minister to, that actually they might have a ministry in their own right. And part of our task as a church is to help them to develop their ministry, not just look after them. Another example, Alan and I were in a church where we were served the bread of communion by a woman with Down syndrome. And my heart sang, and I think God's heart sang too. But I was left thinking, why is that so exceptional? Why don't we see that more often? So let's go back to James and his upbringing as a little boy. It's okay his mum didn't have favourites. And his mum corrected unacceptable behaviour. Let's assume she did. And so he's bringing this into his letter. Brothers, he says, I'm sure he means sisters as well, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring him back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of his ways will save him from death and cover over a multitude of sins. Now, it's talking about discipline, isn't it? And I think this is the job of the vicar, to actually speak with someone who is displaying clearly immoral behaviour in their private lives. But that's not just what James is talking about. It's really good to read these passages in different versions. And if you look at the Message, it says, if you know people who have wandered off from God's truth, don't write them off. Go after them. Get them back, and you will have rescued precious lives from destruction. I guess we all know someone who was a solid Christian, a solid churchgoer, and for whatever reason, they've wandered off. We're supposed to go after them and bring them back. How do we do that? I would suggest with prayer, humility, love, perseverance, and obviously the help and wisdom of the Holy Spirit. So, and one example of how we might be able to do this, some of you might be doing this, is to actually send the links to the church service to these people. Because there are many people who've been away from church so long, coming back through the door would actually be a major hurdle for them. They would be worried about what reception they would receive. It might be overwhelming, or it might be a little bit, and they'd be scared to do that. But they would be quite comfortable watching the online service in the privacy of their own homes. So if you haven't sent the link to the service, just pray about who you might send it to. So I began with an earwig, who is, according to my mum, a good mother. And James learnt from his own good mothering and passed on his wisdom from the Mother Church of Jerusalem to the other churches spread around. And he has much to say to us too. Here specifically about valuing, including, and making room for those who are poor in the eyes of the world. God has chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world, says James, to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him. And he also has something to say to us about helping to bring back those who have wandered away. What part might God be asking you to play in those two tasks?